There has been a large amount of scrutiny that has battered law enforcement officers in the past several years. Police officers have felt attacked, misunderstood, wrongly blamed, and underappreciated. Harsh scrutiny is directed at police actions. Let's take a look at the police role in society. However, there's an important reason for this scrutiny. Police represent the thin blue line between disorder and order. Police are the personification of the power of the state. No other criminal justice professional comes under as much constant and public scrutiny, but no other criminal justice professional wields as much unfettered power and authority over the citizenry. Police have the choice to arrest or not arrest, to mediate or to charge, and in decisions to use deadly force, they even hold the power of life and death. If such power is used fairly, legally, and ethically, there are protectors. If such power is used abusively, arbitrarily, and in corrupt ways, they become our oppressors. In non-democratic countries, police are feared because they act with impunity and maintain those in power. Abusive power and economic corruption exist in the United States as well, although not in pervasive patterns as in some other countries. No doubt the scrutiny police officers endure here helps to keep it that way. Law enforcement in the United States is extremely decentralized, and because of this, it's difficult to get an accurate count of how many law enforcement officers exist. One recent federal report indicates that there could be as many as 1 million sworn and non-sworn law enforcement professionals. Even though there are a few extremely large police departments, the New York City Police Department has over 34,000 officers, most police departments are very small, with about 48% employing fewer than 10 officers. Because of the large differences between departments, it's extremely difficult to have a conversation about policing in this country. Large city police departments are very different than departments in small towns and suburban areas in informal culture, police, and discipline systems. Statistics show that the vast majority of police officers and law enforcement professionals uphold high standards of ethical behavior. However, we must focus on the actions of the deviant few to discover the elements of the profession that open the door to unethical behavior. When one asks most people what the role of policing is in society, the response is some version of catch criminals or fight crime. If one views police as crime control agents, the presumption is that criminals, who are different from the rest of us, are the enemy, and police officers are the soldiers in the war on crime. The crime control model operates under the following principles. Repression of criminal conduct is the most important function. Failure of law enforcement means the breakdown of order. Criminal process is the positive grantor of social freedom, and efficiency is a top priority. Additionally, emphasis is on speed and finality. The conveyor belt is the model for the system, and there's a presumption of guilt. Police perception of their role as crime fighters will lead to certain decisions in their use of force, their definition of duty, and their use of deception and coercion. Public perception of the police mission as primarily crime fighting leads to a willingness to accept certain definitions and justifications of behavior. If one views police as public servants, presumptions are different and include the idea that criminals are not so different from us and, in fact, may be our sons and daughters. Police officers serve all people and owe everyone the duty of civility and legality. Police have a limited ability to affect crime rates on one way or the other because crime is a complex social phenomenon. Under the due process model, the following principles stand out in contrast to those of the crime control model. First, there's a possibility of error. Finality is not a priority, and there's insistence on prevention and elimination of mistakes. Next, efficiency is rejected if it involves shortcuts. Protection is part of the process, and coercive power is subject to abuse. Rather than just an emphasis on rights, as in the due process model, under the public servant model proposed here, law enforcement is perceived as owned by all people, so service is foremost. Police must respond to all constituencies, including groups that may be less supportive of the police than white middle-class communities. It is an enlarged view of the police officer role in society. Rather than simply catching criminals, officers are perceived to be crime preventers, peacekeepers, and service providers. The crime control model of policing is related to the war on crime mentality, with police officers seen as the warriors on the front line. In contrast to the warrior approach to policing is the guardian approach. There has been a growing national movement towards this guardian model of policing. The warrior approach views police as soldiers engaged in a battle. The emphasis is on danger and force. The guardian model, however, sees the officer as a primary protector of the citizenry, but also of democratic values. In academy training, the warrior mindset of power, control, and battle survival is de-emphasized. So what type of policing do we want? Crime fighters or public servants? Those who favor the crime fighter or warrior role are more tolerant of police error in the use of force incidents and in over-policing. Those who believe that police should emphasize the public servant or guardian role are much less tolerant of inappropriate uses of power. Just as the public, police officers tend to perceive one role as dominant over the other, and this perception shapes their daily behavior. Of course, early law enforcement personnel were also involved in social control and employed utilitarian violence. That is, they acted as the force for the power holders in society and were union busters and political machine enforcers. Early police departments were also marred by frequent graft and other forms of corruption. The move towards police professionalism, starting in the 1920s, was spurred by several factors, one of which was to improve the image of police as objective enforcers of the law, rather than enforcers for whomever happened to be in power. In effect, there was a real or perceived shift of police loyalty from political bosses to the law itself. This role de-emphasized the social service role and ultimately led to policing characterized by detachment of the community being policed instead of part of the community itself. The historical social service role of police was reassured in the community policing movement that reached the height of its prevalence in the late 1980s. Community policing involves having officers develop closer relationships with the community and help them solve some of the social problems that are believed to be associated with the development of disorder and crime. In community policing initiatives, police officers are involved in the problems of the community. While community policing was endorsed nationally by federal agencies such as the National Institute of Justice and the Bureau of Justice Assistance, individual police officers across the country were less enthused about the concept. It is important to have some historical perspective on shifts in policing rhetoric and tactics. Policing has always reflected and reacted to historical areas and political shifts. Today, prevalence policing, problem-solving policing, predictive policing, and intelligence-led policing exist in a confused mix of approaches and terminologies. Police play a major role in our society. The history of policing provides context for ongoing enhancement of law enforcement in America. Problem-solving policing arises naturally out of community-based policing, whereby neighborhood problems are identified and dealt with, often in partnership with community members. Predictive policing focuses on sophisticated data gathering and analysis. Geographic analysis is used to identify where criminal events are likely to occur based on where offenders have struck in the past. Intelligence-led policing is a managerial philosophy whereby data analysis and intelligence are used for objective decision-making designed for crime prevention. Today, policing, at least in major cities, is proactive rather than merely reactive and highly sophisticated in terms of crime analysis. Whether police continue to move towards the guardian model or if there's a major retrenchment back to the warrior mentality remains to be seen. The approach of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing was that police should acknowledge the role of policing in the past and present injustice and discrimination, and take steps to restore public trust and confidence. Many factors have led police departments to keep better use of force and stop and frisk records, offering training in de-escalation, CIT, and implicit bias, and reviewing community policing concepts. However, there's also strong resistance to the theme that there's something wrong with policing that needs to be fixed, or that police are systematically biased. Some police leaders and others argue that national scrutiny and criticism has led to such a strong anti-police bias that it's endangered police. According to this view, the constant focus on the few bad apples in policing arguably has created hostility to the point where it's harder for police to do their job and has led to a dramatic increase in ambush-style killings of officers. An annual report by the nonprofit National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund indicated that 64 officers were killed by gunfire in 2016, a 56% increase from the 42 officers killed in 2015. The average since 2004 has been 55 police deaths annually. It is important to have some historical context, however. In 2011, 73 officers were killed in gunfire, the most in any year in the past decade. However, in 1973, 156 police officers were killed by gunfire, and the 1970s averaged about 140 deaths per year. The report then offers some findings from interviews with police officials, specifically that law enforcement not only felt that their national political leaders were against them, but that the public disrespect allowed assailants to become more emboldened to question, resist, and even kill law enforcement officers. One academic study disputes the conclusion that killings of law enforcement officers have been influenced by the events following Ferguson. Using some series analysis, the national data regarding officer killing researchers concluded that there was no substantial relationship between the events after Ferguson and riots and police killings. Another current discussion concerns the so-called Ferguson effect, or YouTube effect, on de-policing. Some distinguish the concepts. However, the idea is that intense public scrutiny and hostility have made police officers so demoralized that they've reduced their self-initiated activities and no longer engage in proactive activities such as engaging in suspicious individuals on the street. This, then, has led to spikes in crime and homicides. In the most recent and comprehensive study of police attitudes, a Pew Research Center study using the National Police Research Platform data of 8,000 officers revealed that about 66% of police officers say that the death of Black Americans during encounters with the police are isolated incidents, not a sign that law enforcement is characterized by a systematic bias. However, 60% of the general population did believe that there's a broader problem between police and minority communities. Most officers reported that high-profile deaths have made their jobs harder. More than 7 in 10 say that officers are less likely to stop and question suspicious people. Roughly 3/4 agreed that fellow officers report that they are more reluctant to use force when necessary, and more than 9 in 10 agreed that fellow officers have grown more worried about their safety. What this study reveals is that there's no national consensus on whether there is a current problem with policing, much less agreement on approaches to improve policing. Police power is a governmental right invested in federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. It means that those organizations, unlike almost any other except perhaps the military, have the right to control citizens' movements to the point of using physical and even deadly force to do so. To best understand power and discretion, we need to define a few terms. Authority is an unquestionable entitlement to be obeyed that comes from fulfilling a specific role. Power is the right inherent in a role to use any means to overcome resistance. Persuasion is the use of signs, symbols, words, and arguments to induce compliance. Force is the authority to use physical coercion to overcome the will of an individual. Discretion is the authority to make a decision between two or more choices. Cohen and Fieldberg in 1991 developed a careful analysis of and justification for police power and proposed that it stems from the social contract. Social contract is the concept in which the state of nature is a war of all against all, and thus individuals give up their liberty to aggress against others in return for safety. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke created a concept of the social contract to explain why people have given up liberties in civilized societies. According to this theory, each citizen gives up complete liberty in return for societal protection against others. Complete freedom is given up in return for guaranteed protection. Police power is part of this quid pro quo. We give the police these powers to protect us, but we also recognize that their power can be used against us. This general idea has corollary principles. First, each of us should be able to feel protected. If not, we're not gaining anything from the social contract and may decide to renegotiate the contract by regaining some of the liberties given up. Second, because the deprivations of freedom are limited to those necessary to ensure protection against others, police power should be circumscribed to the minimum necessary to meet the goals of protection. Third, police ethics are linked to their purpose. Cohen and Fieldberg in 1991 proposed 5 ethical standards that can be derived from the social contract: fair access, public trust, safety and security, teamwork, and objectivity. Law enforcement, if it's lawful, objective, and professional, is part of the foundation of a stable government and a hallmark of democratic societies. Research points out the elements of democratic policing include the following: responsiveness, accountability, defense of human rights, and transparency. Research shows that people are more likely to view law enforcement as legitimate if their experience includes the elements of procedural justice, voice, neutrality, respect, and trustworthiness. Voice refers to when people can express themselves and police officers listen to them. Neutrality is the concept of equity, specifically that police officers do not discriminate and treat everyone equally. Respect is when citizens feel that they're being treated with respect, even those who have committed a crime. Trustworthiness is the idea that individuals trust police to do the right thing and act within the law. A Gallup poll has measured respect for police since 1965. In 2010, 57% of Americans, when asked about a profession's honesty and integrity, rated police as high or very high. This is down from about 68% in 2001, but up from 1995 when only 41% of the population rated police integrity and honesty as high or very high. In the 2014 poll, 48%, and in 2016, 56% of respondents rated police integrity and honesty as high or very high. In 2016, respect for police surged to 76% of Americans having a great deal or quite a lot of respect for police. Note that this stands in stark contrast to the perception that police are facing widespread public hostility. Communities can increase perceptions of procedural justice by training police to interact with citizens in a less authoritarian manner and provide training on de-escalation and implicit bias. Public perceptions of police misconduct influence the public trust in the police and recognition of police as agents of legal and moral authority. Every day is filled with decisions, some minor, some major. Discretion allows officers to choose different courses of action depending on how they perceive their duty. Duty can be defined as the responsibilities that are attached to a specific role. In the case of police officers, there's a great deal of individual variation in how officers perceive their duty. One way researchers have described how discretion is utilized is through typologies of police. Police styles can be described as follows. The legalistic style of policing is described as the least amenable to the discretionary enforcement. Officers enforce the law objectively without making exceptions. The watchman style describes police who define situations as threatening or serious depending on the group or individual involved and act accordingly. The caretaker style treats citizens differently depending on their relative power and position in society. Some people get breaks, others do not. Patrol officers are the most visible members of the police force and have a duty to patrol, monitor, and intervene in matters of crime, conflict, accident, and welfare. Discretion also comes into play when an officer is faced with situations that have no good solutions. In these cases, officers often face extremely difficult decisions, which sometimes result in violence when a mentally ill person attacks the officer who won't put down a weapon. Generally, the command language and intimidating approach of police officers is extremely counterproductive when an individual is in mental distress and can lead to violence. In situations where lethal force is used, such force is almost always legally justified. However, the actions of the officer leading up to the threat may have exacerbated the situation rather than helped to avoid the need for the use of force. Police officers also frequently respond to domestic disputes. One officer may ascertain that departmental policy or law does not dictate any action if no party is seriously injured and no one wants to press charges. However, another officer might take a shaken or distraught victim to a shelter, drive her to a relative's home, or wait with her until family or friends arrive. Historically, law enforcement's response to domestic violence was non-interference, with the perception that domestic violence was not a crime control matter unless it involved injury amounting to felony assault. A code of ethics helps engender a self-respect in individual officers. Pride comes from knowing that one has conducted oneself in a proper and appropriate manner. Further, a code of ethics contributes to mutual respect among police officers and helps in the development of esprit de corps and common goals. Agreement on methods, means, and aims is important to these feelings. Within any profession, an agreed-upon code of ethics is a unifying element. A code can help define law enforcement as a profession, for it indicates a willingness to uphold certain standards of behavior and prompts the goal of public service, an essential element of any profession. Police officers generally pledge an oath upon graduation from an academy, and many police agencies have adopted a code of ethics. The International Association of Chiefs of Police, the IACP, proclamated the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics and the Canons of Police Ethics, and many departments have used these or adopted them for their own agencies. More recently, the IACP has endorsed the Oath of Honor. This oath, developed by a committee of the IACP, is offered as a shorthand version encapsulating the contents of the Code of Ethics. The IACP Code, or other codes of ethics for law enforcement, have at least 4 major themes. Let's take a look. Justice. The principle of justice or fairness is the single most dominant theme in law enforcement code. A second theme is that of service. Police officers exist to serve the community, and their role appropriately and essentially concerns this idea. Still another theme is the importance of the law. Police are protectors of the Constitution and must not substitute rules of their own. The final theme is one of personal conduct. Police must uphold a standard of behavior consistent with their public position. The emphasis on service, justice for all groups, and higher standards for police behavior is consistent with the public service mission of policing. Factors that lead to extreme nature of police subcultures include: police typically are a homogeneous social group, they have uniquely stressful work environments, they participate in a basically closed social system. Certain elements of law enforcement environment create elements of the subculture. There is a framework whereby the occupational environment creates coping mechanisms and outcomes. The perception of danger leads to suspiciousness. The duty to employ coercive authority leads to maintaining the edge, which refers to the idea of officers always being in control over their surroundings. Supervisor scrutiny leads to a lay low or cover your ass CYA approach to performance. Finally, role ambiguity is related to investing in the crime fighter orientation. Social isolation and loyalty are described as outcomes of the environment officers work in. Many authors present versions of the informal code of conduct that new officers are taught through informal socialization that is quite different from the formal code of ethics described before. What's obvious is the informal code of behavior is different from the formal principles espoused by management. Some principles of the informal code directly contradict the elements of formal codes of ethics. Noble cause corruption refers to the utilitarian concept that the ends of crime fighting justifies the means that might otherwise be illegal, unethical, or against the rules or regulations. Arguably, the police culture, at least in some locations, endorses or tolerates this type of activity. This is evidenced by the fact that studies have shown that about 60% of rookies support mild lies to achieve a conviction. Code of silence is the practice of officers not coming forward when they're aware of an ethical transgression of other officers. The blue curtain of secrecy is another name for this code of silence. This phenomenon has been recognized in academic literature, first-person accounts by former officers, and even cited in court holdings. It should also be noted that the code of silence is present in other occupations and groups as well, even when members engage in incompetent or corrupt activities. Good officers can be sucked into the corrupt cover-ups because of the nature of policing. Every officer does something wrong, and most common mistakes, perhaps, is using too much force. When coworkers cover for the officer who made the mistake is indebted and trapped in a situation where the other officer thinks he or she must do the same. The code of silence can be considered on a continuum, where observing and not coming forward is on the left side of the continuum, representing a passive position towards misconduct of officers. More serious actions occur when officers actively lie to supervisors or prejudice themselves in an effort to cover up wrongdoing. Loyalty in police work is explained by police officers' dependence on one another, sometimes in life or death situation. If police officers feel isolated from the community, their loyalty is to other police officers and not the community at large. To address abuses of loyalty, one would not want to attack the loyalty itself because it's necessary for the health of the organization. Rather, one would want to engage loyalty beyond other officers to the department and the community. Administrators are often the ones who retaliate against whistleblowers, telling the accused officer who informed them, or supporting implicitly or explicitly the retaliation against the officer who came forward. Several factors contribute to the possible weakening of subculture. Let's take a look. Increasing diversity of police recruits has eliminated the social homogeneity of the workplace. Many diverse groups are now represented in police departments. Police unions, with their increasing power, formalize relationships between line staff and the administration. Civil litigation has increased the risk of covering up for an officer. Although police officers may lie to internal affairs or even on the witness stand to save a fellow officer from sanctions, they may be less likely to do so when large monetary damages can be levied against them because negligence or perjury. There is no doubt that police subculture varies from department to department. Size, regional differences, and management may influence the strength of the subculture. The makeup of the department, its relationship with the community, and training may also influence the type of occupational culture found in any department.